Welcome to the Voices of War, a podcast with a simple vision to bring to life the true costs of war through the voices of those who've lived it. I'm your host Maz, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Okay, here I am again for another insightful discussion on the ongoing tensions in Ukraine. As you will hear, I spoke with a very knowledgeable and articulate expert who is widely recognized as having the ability to scratch below the mainstream narratives. This episode was recorded on the evening of Wednesday the 2nd of February, Australian time, which makes it the morning of Wednesday the 2nd of February in Europe. I hope you get value out of this discussion. My guest today is Wolfgang Sporrer, who is an Adjunct Professor at the Hertie School in Berlin. He used to be the head of the Human Dimension Department of the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission in Kyiv, where he led the civilian aspects of conflict management and facilitated and promoted dialogue between the opposing sides. Before that, he was the head of the international oil and gas company OMV's representation in the Caspian region, where he spearheaded regional efforts to promote the Southern Gas Corridor for the EU. Previously, he served as the head of the Europa House for the European Commission in Baku, Azerbaijan, and as the head of the Democratisation Department of the OSCE Presence in Albania. He also served as a political advisor in the EU delegation in Moscow and in several functions for the OSCE in Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Kosovo. He joins me today to discuss the ongoing situation in Ukraine. Wolfgang, thank you very much for joining me on the Voices of War.
Thank you for the invitation.
So you've had quite a extensive career in a number of war zones, Wolfgang. Maybe we can start by just finding out a little bit about you. How did you end up in this particular line of work? And then how did you land in peace negotiations for the OSCE?
Well, I studied law at Vienna University, and then I followed this up with a degree in international relations at Johns Hopkins in Bologna, where I met a really colorful and great crowd of people. After which I really wanted to work somehow internationally. I didn't really have a big idea of what this would mean and what one really needs to do. Mm-hmm. So I called kind of my foreign ministry and asked them whether they would second me to the OSCE, as this was in a way the organization that was a lot in the media at the time and so on. And they said, listen, without experience, we're not going to second you anywhere. So you need to get some experience first. And then, as it usually is, without experience, you can get experience. So it was a little difficult until one day, the foreign ministry called me up. That was in the year of 1998, when there was a civil war in Albania, and said, well, we have an opportunity there for you as an election observer in Albania, which is where they were actively shooting. It was in the media every day that the situation is a complete disaster. So they had probably called everybody on their list, and I was kind of somewhere near the bottom. And after a little bit of thinking, I said, well, okay, let's, I'll that's experience, right? That's what it is. And so I ended up going to Albania just for a short mission. I think it was 2 weeks. After which my Austrian foreign ministry said, okay, where do you want to go next? We have Croatia or Bosnia for a long-term secondment to choose from. And that's kind of how I wouldn't say ended up, but that's how I joined the OSCE and the world of international organizations.
That is amazing. So if I heard you right, you're putting down your successful career to the fact that a whole bunch of people said no before you.
Well, it was, there has to be always a beginning somewhere. You have to do a lot during, but there has to be a beginning somewhere.
Yeah. And I note that you served then with OSCE in both Bosnia and Croatia. I mean, as we mentioned before recording, I'm born and raised in Sarajevo and deeply experienced that conflict. And what kind of work were you doing for OSCE in Bosnia?
Well, I started out working as a field monitor for the OSCE mission into Croatia. Mm-hmm. And I was posted in a field office, obviously, in the very beautiful town of Zadar.
Oh, wow.
But whoever knows this region knows that while Zadar itself is a very beautiful and very even cosmopolitan urban city with a lot of tourists, the hinterland of Zadar, when it goes up to the mountains, is a very, very different place. It's a place where the ethnic tensions were extremely high, where nationalism of all sorts was extremely intense, and where at the time when I was there, that was 99, 2000, people were traumatized from a real post-war situation in which we worked. So that was in Croatia. I also ended up afterwards working for the OSCE in Sarajevo, in the head office, in the headquarters, as a senior political advisor. Short after, and my responsibility was dealing with, I don't know whether by chance or by design of my boss, who was an American ambassador, Bob Berry. Mm-hmm. I was again responsible for Bosnian Croat issues. So I spent a lot of time traveling from Sarajevo to the so-called Herzegovina part.
That's right, yeah, of course.
To Široki Brijeg, to Livno, etc., where I again encountered extremely strong nationalism, as is hard to encounter anywhere else, actually. Yes, so I that was my experience in the, let's say, in the Slavic part of former Yugoslavia, but I also worked in Slavic majority part of former Yugoslavia. Let me be precise here. Yes, I also worked in Kosovo, also in Pristina.
Right.
Where my job was to work with the Serbian communities to convince them that potentially taking part in Kosovo elections is not a bad idea in 2000, 2001, 2002. That's already all a very long time ago. But I really did work in Southeastern Europe, in the Western Balkans. That also includes Albania, which is also a wonderful country to live and work in. Yeah. But there's always been, let's say, the thread of a conflict or post-conflict situations in which I operated.
And I guess the complexity of that region of Western Balkans in particular would have set you up really well to then take on the role that you did working for OSCE in Ukraine. Maybe you can just explain what that role actually means, because the title's Human Dimension Department. I'll let you maybe explain what it actually is.
Well, the term human dimension is something that is very OSCE specific.
Right.
It comes from the Helsinki Final Act, where security issues were divided in three so-called baskets. The Helsinki Final Act, 1975, foundational document for European security, defines security in a really broad, or as they call it in the OSCE, comprehensive way. And security is divided in three so-called baskets. The first basket is called the so-called political-military aspects. That means everything having to do with guns, soldiers, classical old school security.
Yeah.
The second basket is called the economic and environmental basket. That means everything having to do with, obviously, economics and environment. And the third basket, or the third dimension, is the so-called human dimension. And the human dimension comprises everything from human rights, democracy, elections, minority issues, anything that you would define. The UN has a tiny bit different terminology. They call this the human dimension. The UN, they call it human security issues. Mm-hmm. It's called human security. In the OSCE, it's called human dimension, but it's the, human rights, democracy, the soft parts of security. In Ukraine, what this entailed was mainly dealing with the civilian aspects, with the civilian victims of the conflict. That means corroborating civilian casualties. That means confirming or helping to repair critical infrastructure so that people would have water, they would have access to heating, to gas, etc., etc. And generally working with the affected communities to see what can be improved in actual human lives on the ground. And this very much also included facilitating dialogue between the opposing sides. And this brings us kind of very close to the current conflict in Ukraine and the current ongoing issues, because defining what are the sides in this conflict is something that is done very often, very wrongly. When I listen to the media, particularly American media, and they say, it's a war between Russian speakers and Ukrainian speakers, I really have to touch my head and say, okay, from now on, I stop listening, because you obviously haven't understood anything about the situation in this country.
Yeah. And that's maybe a very good place to start, because that's one of the principal questions that I want to get into. Who are these stakeholders? What is, what are the sides? Because you're right, the mainstream dialogue and narratives are so confused, and I guess we'll get to that. But maybe we can start with that. Who are the parties?
Well, who are the parties in the Ukrainian context? I like to explain it as three concentric circles. Mm-hmm. This conflict really has three dimensions. The first, an inner circle, which is likely the least important, is an intra-Ukrainian conflict. It's an intra-Ukrainian conflict. There are important differences between Ukrainians that run in various ways. First of all, you have the linguistic difference. Russian speakers, Ukrainian speakers. That's just one aspect. Mm-hmm. Then you have different historical views of how Ukraine, what type of country is Ukraine? Is Ukraine a multicultural, multi-ethnic country? Or is Ukraine a country for Ukrainians? You have a divided church, used to have a divided church. Kyiv Patriarchate, Moscow Patriarchate.
Okay.
I also always say the best thing to know, to kind of spot these differences, is if you ask a Ukrainian, did you Ukrainians win or lose World War II? Because the society is really not of one opinion on that. You will find many Ukrainians who go out on 9th of May proudly celebrating the victory over Hitler. And you will find many who will say, okay, that was the loss of our nationhood. That was the beginning of our occupation by Russia.
Wow.
So
Okay.
it really, and this all goes back to World War II. As you probably know, one of the biggest and let's say most controversial figures of Ukrainian history is a person called Stepan Bandera. Mm-hmm. Stepan Bandera is, for a small part of Ukrainians, a real national hero. In the center of Lemberg, of Lviv, Ukrainian, Lvov, Russian, they erected a statue to Stepan Bandera. In the east of Ukraine, in Donetsk, also in Kharkiv, Dnipropetrovsk, Stepan Bandera is akin to a real historical villain, somebody akin to Hitler, like a really full villain. Who was Bandera? Bandera was a Ukrainian nationalist fighter who fought for the Ukrainian nation, but also happened to ally himself with the Nazis, with Hitler Germany, in order to, because he thought he would get Ukrainian independence out of this, which was a...
So this now makes sense why the just in the Security Council, the Russian, it wasn't foreign minister, I'm not sure who was speaking.
It was the US, the UN ambassador.
Sorry, that's right. That was basically accusing the West of basically promoting a Nazi regime. And maybe that's perhaps the link that they're trying to invoke.
That is the Russian narrative.
Wow, okay. Even though Zelensky is Jewish, which I find absolutely bizarre, right?
That is the core Russian narrative. I mean, there is, as to many narratives, it's complex.
Yeah, complex, of course. What is it with us Slavs?
on the Maidan in 2014, which was really a grassroots movement where people were, demonstrating for more democracy, more Europe, more freedom. I mean, what people generally know about the Maidan. Yeah. Of course, there were people running around and demonstrating with a picture of Stepan Bandera, of this historical figure who was actually allied with the Nazis, which made it quite easy to frame, for the Russians, to frame the narrative that these are all the people who support the Nazis. This is the new Nazi regime. This is the Banderovci regime. So that's that there is something behind everything, yes. And I was actually listening to Nebenzia and I thought, okay, here we go again with the Russian. So these are the divisions inside Ukraine.
Yeah.
Largely, not 100%, but largely, this is also East and West. That means in the West, you have the, Ukrainian-speaking people who would have a particular view of history, who would think that, many of whom would think that Ukraine did actually not win World War II, who have a positive to a neutral view on Stepan Bandera, who are looking mainly to Poland, to the West, and in the eastern part of the country, largely, it's not a stark division. You have the people for whom Stepan Bandera is a villain, who would historically really look to Russia for the next big country, who are very proud of the role of Ukraine and Ukrainians in World War II, and who have that particular, let's say, view of history. So that's the inner concentric circle, right?
Can I just ask a question on that? Because I mean, as you're talking, I'm hearing echoes of Bosnia, where the confusion between ethnicity and nationality played such a big role, where defining yourself as a Serb in Bosnia, it dictates your affiliation to the east, to Serbia, or defining yourself as a Croat in Bosnia, your loyalty is generally to the west, to Zagreb, that was one of the issues, that the Bosnian national identity was always diluted because of the, I guess, ethnic nationality. Is that something similar? Because that's kind of at least what
I would be very, very, very careful. I will come to this to make this comparison. because it could be very easily misleading, and I'll tell you why.
Mm-hmm.
These inner divisions, these inner Ukrainian divisions are something that you have in many other countries as well, without a war and without a conflict. Yeah, these divisions have been there forever, ever since there is Ukraine, for the past 13 years. Independent Ukraine has never led to war. We have these divisions in Austria. The Western Austrians, they have a completely different dialect than we have. It's a really small country, So politically, it looks different in Western Austria than in Eastern Austria, a small country. So these divisions, in the case of Ukraine, would, without Russian help, not have led to war. They would have not led to war. There was never a spark of a Ukrainian civil war over language, over ethnicity, over Stepan Bandera, over this and that. But of course, the substance for conflict was there, as it is there in many other countries. But it needed the spark, and that spark was, in the case of the Ukrainian situation, it was more than a spark. It was a little bit like a flamethrower that ignited this kind of substance, was ignited by Russia. That's very clear. So divisions, yes. So again, the narratives are always interesting. When you ask a Ukrainian, let's say official Ukrainian, or no Ukrainian, Ukrainian nationalist or patriot, it is you mention in a Ukrainian tension. They say, no, we don't have any tensions. No. This is not a civil war at all. No, don't. There's nothing to see. Move on. It's all Russia. It's attack from Russia from the outside.
Right.
When you ask the Russians, when you ask Mr. Nebensia, he said, this is a Ukrainian civil war. We have nothing to do with that. This is an inner Ukrainian matter. Yeah. We're there. We're happy to mediate in this conflict between these parties, but that's a Ukrainian civil war. Yeah. The reality is obviously a little bit closer to the Ukrainian than to the Russian position, but it would be lying to oneself if one would deny this existence of these historical and current tensions inside Ukrainian society. Okay, yeah. But we're only at the
first circle.
Yeah, so we're moving at snail's pace with the explanation of the conflict. Yeah, it is only the inner circle. The second circle is a Russian-Ukrainian bilateral problem. Is the historical relationship between Russia and Ukraine. That doesn't need so much explanation. Obviously, Russia needs Ukraine for transit of pipeline, for transit of gas. They hate being really dependent on Ukraine for that. That's also why they did Nord Stream 2. They depend on Ukraine for many industrial issues, helicopter engines. But so that's one thing. Russia really needs Ukraine. Ukraine also really used to need and still needs Russia. Geography, it's hard to change geography. Ukraine is not an island. So there are and when you start playing with these mutual dependencies, with, playing with a gas issue, playing with a transit issue, playing economic games here and there, that also fuels conflict. That can easily spark conflict. These are really important things.
Yeah.
Gas for Russia is so important. We'll come to that, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So that's the second dimension. And the third dimension is the East-West dimension. The third dimension is the East-West dimension. And the East-West dimension is the one we are now really seeing playing out. And the East-West dimension is, I think it was Brzezinski, speaking of Brzezinski, security advisor to Jimmy Carter, who said, without Ukraine, Russia is just a big country. And with Ukraine, it's an empire. So that, you don't need to know much more than that. when you look at NATO and at the Americans moving into Ukraine, joining Ukraine to NATO, into the American sphere of influence, is an ultimate goal, an ultimate victory. It's the forward patrol base of NATO. To have rockets, soldiers, 5 hours drive from Moscow, that's a Cold War hawk's dream. Mm. So they have consistently, and here I'm mainly talking about the US, not so much the European allies are a little bit more cautious here, but clearly, strategically, Ukraine as the forward patrolling base for NATO is a huge strategic goal. Yeah. Mm. The same goes for the Russian side. Russia does not, let's put it like this, Russia thinks that they just cannot allow that under any circumstances. Mm. They have historical experiences. Napoleon came through these lands. Hitler came through these lands. They think that having an alliance which they perceive to be an enemy, right there at their doorstep, in their historical brother on which they are dependent in so many ways, is just not acceptable. Kind of a red line. So here we have the East-West dimension of this entire conundrum. So just to repeat, Ukrainian conflict in a short 10-minute analysis, 3 circles, inner circle, inner Ukrainian tensions, second circle, Russian-Ukrainian bilateral issues, third circle, East-West dimension playing out in Ukraine. And only behind the conflict, if you ask me.
That's a wonderfully visual way to represent the conflict as well, and I thank you for that, because I think that's a very useful way, and not one that we often hear. Because one of the things, and it strikes me as though the grand narrative, or the third circle of the East and West, is the one that's at play the hardest at the moment, right? And because we know also that even President Zelensky himself has said, "Hey, this is nothing's new." Not just stop the war rhetoric.
Very interesting.
Which is confusing, right? So it strikes me that third circle is really the one that's at play here, and my mind boggles, because that to me it almost seems surreal that that's where we are. That we are really in this kind of Cold War mentality, East West. Yeah.
I think what you're saying is extremely pertinent. And for me, this is also one of the, how should I put it, most disturbing parts of the current debate. The more the tensions rise, the less people talk about Ukraine. Ukraine doesn't even seem to play a role anymore. Ukraine is basically, as it used to be so many times in history, a pawn between East and West. Yeah. And this is really, really, really sad. And Zelensky's position is, I believe, extremely interesting, because in the beginning, Ukraine really had an interest in, playing this up, because the conflict in the East, which is ongoing, where there is ongoing shooting every day. Read the reports of the OSCE, public, everyday shooting. Yeah. This had a little bit vanished from the headlines. These people were saying, it's like this frozen conflict, which it is not. It's not a frozen conflict, but this had really vanished a little bit from the headlines. So I think initially Ukraine was rightly quite content that it was back in the headlines, that it was actually really highlighted that Ukraine is a victim of Russian aggression, which it is. There is no question about it. The conflict in the East, as I have said to you, would have never broken out without Russian ignition providing the spark. So that was okay. Meanwhile, the discussion has become so surreal and so hysterical, partially, that the president of Ukraine says, hey, guys, listen, don't run away to Germany. Nothing has happened. Nothing has happened. What has not happened, what had not happened for the past, 4 or 5 years.
Yeah.
One thing that also is completely out of the headlines these days is that this Russian troop concentration that is now existing on the Ukrainian border is something that is not happening for the first time. It had happened in the spring of 2021. It had happened in June 2020. It had happened before the pandemic. This is not a first time or particularly remarkable event.
Even at these numbers, I mean, with the figures that are being thrown around is 130,000, and they're being dragged from in from Siberia, etc. And there's that's part of the narrative.
Yes, that's part of the narrative, and I would be very, I would say, cautious when it comes to descriptions of what is actually happening and how many soldiers they actually have in what location. And I will tell you why I would be cautious. Russia is not putting these informations out. Russia does not say we have amassed, 150,000 troops, and they are there in case. They haven't said anything. So our information that we have is, in essence, leaked intelligence. Yeah, It's intelligence that is either transported to the media by politicians. Politicians have interests. There is nothing bad about it, but politicians have interests.
Of course, yeah.
Or it's done by leaked intelligence. Like many media say, we have intelligence sources, and European bureaucrats are saying, we get secret intelligence from here and there. We have been talking to the, to these and these groups, and this leaked intelligence can only be trusted insofar that one takes into account that whoever leaks that intelligence leaks politically curated intelligence. If you want to present a certain picture for your own political narrative, and you have intelligence, and you want to convince somebody, you're gonna share the part of intelligence that you want out there, and you're not going to hold back. This is completely normal, but you cannot trust numbers that come from politicians without any corroboration as a necessarily accurate picture, a reflection of reality.
But to be fair as well, in that case, I mean, it was also I think the Pentagon just put out, I think it was over the past 24, 48 hours, I've read in the New York Times that they've put out official statements saying that, not only is there, 130,000 troops amassed around Ukraine, but also that Russia now has the capability to invade whole of Ukraine, which to me was preposterous after, and I'm not sure, I think you might have heard my chat to your former colleague Arne, who, echoed that sentiment that to actually invade whole of Ukraine would require lots and lots more. But what are your thoughts on that? Yeah.
My thoughts on that are, does Russia have the capability to invade all of Ukraine? Yes, absolutely. Does Germany have the capability to invade all of Austria? Yes. Does the US have the capability to invade all of Canada? Yes, of course. That's not the question. The question is, will they do it? Is there an interest for them to do it? And here I would really caution, and I would say that Putin so far has always been a rational actor in foreign policy. And Putin's domestic policy is horrendous. What they have done with Navalny is a crime. The decline of human rights in Russia and free speech is an absolute disaster. But that does not take away from the fact that in foreign policy issues, he has been a rational, not a good, benign, but a rational actor. Invading Ukraine would be a totally irrational and, frankly, extremely stupid thing to do. It would be stupid because they would face a resistance. First of all, the war would be very bloody, horribly bloody. Secondly, they would face an ongoing guerrilla war with the Ukrainian population, well armed, by the way. Ongoing, compared to which Chechnya was not mentionable, cakewalk. Plus, the West would be fueling this kind of situation with political support, weapons, intelligence, etc. So I think to invade the whole of Ukraine is a scenario that would be so dumb and so horrible. No one would profit from it. That in light of the fact that Putin has been a rational political actor, I do not regard as very likely. The same, by the way, goes for invading other parts of Ukraine. I mean, they have, by all standards, already invaded part of Ukraine. But to take this further would just do the same I just described, just on a smaller scale. It would mean that whatever they do not occupy would join NATO more or less immediately, or without joining NATO, would become a forward patrol base for America, for the West. They would face the same. Resistance from the local population wherever they go now. Absolutely. So also that would be a very, very, very irrational move, which I hope my wishing does not influence my rational thinking, but both of them say, no, it's not going to happen.
Okay. So, well, I guess now we're getting to the crux of it all, because we can safely say that the inner circle of the three concentric circles is not really influencing what's happening right now. We can also say, because that's status quo, right? That's the ongoing Ukraine identity that's still unfolding, and it's an internal discussion. We can also probably say that the second one is status quo, nothing new, right? This is all since 2014. The ongoing tensions between Russia and Ukraine aren't new. Even to the point that since December, nothing new has really happened. And why we can also comfortably say that it is the third circle really that we're talking about is because it was in December that when all this started is when Putin put the demands forward to NATO, in other words, to US, because it's NATO in the eyes of Putin, but also in reality, NATO is the US, right? So therefore, we are now talking. It is between two presidents. Between the Russian Federation and the United States of America. That's really what this comes down to. So what do either of those, so Biden and Putin, what do they stand to gain from this current crisis? If we assume that both of them are in one way or another fueling it, right? Because on one hand, Putin is undoubtedly he's the one that threw the letter in saying these are my demands, and kind of threw the cat amongst the pigeons, as they say. But of course, US is really ramping up the rhetoric of inevitable war, inevitable invasion. So what drives these two leaders?
Well, you're asking a question about the interests of the sides. Let's look at the US side, which is a little bit easier to explain, I believe. Easier, but also more murky, if that's possible at the same time.
Yes. Yeah.
Because I can only think of a couple of reasons why the US is so active in ramping up tensions that even the Ukrainians are saying, hey, guys, no, leave us out of this. It doesn't matter anymore. No.
Yeah.
And the US media, it's only about scenarios how Russia invades via this river or via this ridge, which is all completely mad, if you ask me. So why are they doing this? I mean, as we all know, Biden is in a horrible situation back home. Biden is in a situation that he has control he should have control of the Senate, which he does not. He has not gotten through two of his big political agendas. His popularity is really low. So in a very, let's say, simplistic way, that's usually what US presidents have done when the domestic agenda looked really, really bad. One focuses on a big international threat discussion where you can look tough, where you are, in a big leading position. And also the US credibility in international affairs has been damaged so badly by the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and that was only the latest let's say iteration of this damage of US image abroad. It has also been damaged really badly by their, well, what's the diplomatic word for betrayal of the Kurds in northern Iraq? So that really got them in a place where many allies would think, okay, the US as a friend is absolutely, worthless because they let their allies down. That may be another thing to say, okay, now we need to really stand up for our ally Ukraine. So it has, I think, these two dimensions on the US side. On the Russian side, it's, as always, as many things that have to do with Russia, a little bit more complex. I think that the Russians have these security interests. What they think they have these security interests, which they put in the letter. Yes, the troops and NATO and this and that. But they also have other interests. And the Russians will look at this from a holistic perspective. And there are parts of Russian demands and wishes that are in the letter. I'm not saying that these are pretend wishes. They are real wishes. But there are also other wishes and other interests that are not in the letter. And mainly here, we need to talk about gas exports and mainly about the Nord Stream 2. Mm-hmm. Russia has invested a lot of money into this pipeline. The pipeline is absolutely ready.
And just on Nord Stream 2, just to clarify for my own sake, it's owned by Gazprom, right? Which is effectively a Russian state, if That's not correct. Owned, but it's a very heavily influenced company, right?
It's majority owned by a Russian state company, by Gazprom. Yes.
Yeah.
So, and there have been political problems in Europe and regulatory problems in Europe. Why this gas pipeline is not starting yet? Many European countries have opposed this gas pipeline strongly. Ukraine has opposed it strongly. Poland has opposed it strongly. Most European countries, except Germany and Austria, have had by now come out strongly against having this gas pipeline running. That was before this kind of war talk right now. Mm-hmm. Now, there has been an interesting shift in rhetoric over the past couple of days. And the shift of rhetoric has been as follows. Until the spring of this year, until the fall of last year, shortly after the German elections, many people thought Nord Stream 2 was dead. And many thought, okay, now we have the Greens in the government in Germany. The new foreign minister, Baerbock, she was very critical when she was not foreign minister. People would have thought, okay, there will not be a German permission to operate Nord Stream 2. There's European pressure, etc., US pressure, strong US pressure.
Just before we get too bogged into it, I just want to ask a clarifying question because a lot of my audience might not be aware why Nord Stream 2 was so sensitive. particularly, and if I'm correct, it's very different for Ukraine and Poland to what it is for Western Europe. For why the UK was against it, why France. So it might be just worth clarifying that before.
Nord Stream 2 is a gas pipeline that connects Russia directly with Germany through the sea. Up to this point, Russia was exporting their gas to Germany largely through Ukraine. So Ukraine got a lot of transit fees. It had control, de facto control, how much Russia can export to their main customers in Germany. And so Russia decided to circumvent Ukraine, build a new pipeline to have direct deliveries of gas to Germany. And this is why it split Europe in people who really loved this pipeline, because they were no longer dependent on, unreliable transit countries.
The second circle, right?
That's the second circle. That's precisely the second circle. Precisely that, and people who said this is dangerous. It splits Europe. It hurts Ukraine. It makes Russia. It increases the power of Russia over Europe. It makes Germany dependent on Russia. That's what Russia wants, etc., etc. So there have been U.S. sanctions against this pipeline, which then have gone away. Biden has taken them back, but Trump, very strong U.S. sanctions on that pipeline. So that pipeline was really in trouble, right? Let's just focus where we came. The pipeline was really in trouble. U.S. sanctions, German Greens, new government, split Europe. But the Russians really want this pipeline. Yeah. Now the new rhetoric. That's the situation until, October, November last year. Now, new rhetoric coming out from Europe, repeated by the United States. If Russia attacks Ukraine, there will be no Nord Stream 2.
Yeah.
Okay. What does the reverse conclusion mean from that? It means that if there is no invasion, there will be Nord Stream 2.
It's conditional. That's right. It's an if-then condition, right? If invasion, no Nord Stream, and then if you flip it, if no invasion, then Nord Stream. So it's
exactly. So and then there are people who says, well, if that's what it takes to appease the Russians, but to have a pipeline that generally makes a lot of sense. At the end of the day, I'm not going to go into this debate. It's a long debate. I worked in the gas industry a while, so I may be a little bit biased. But that is, from an economic perspective, kind of makes sense.
And just to double tap on that, it's not just Germany. Just to make that clear, it wouldn't be just Germany that benefits from Nord Stream 2, right? It's majority of the EU countries that would, to some extent, less or more benefit from it.
The benefits is a dangerous word. Who knows who benefits? Who would receive gas from Nord Stream 2? That's how I would.
Good. Yeah, okay. No,
I would word it.
That makes sense. Makes sense. Yeah.
Because there's already a value judgment in benefits.
Agreed.
So here we know it wouldn't be just Germany. Austria, Eastern Europe, very much. No, that's true. So this is an interesting aspect, right? So, and then I will also point you to an interesting aspect of Russian foreign policy that if you go back for the last, 10, 15, 20 years, particularly since Mr. Lavrov has been foreign minister, there is a pattern recognizable. There is a pattern recognizable to ramp up tensions, make threats horrible, and then climb down one step and be rewarded for it, for being constructive, reasonable, etc., etc. So you yourself ramp up tensions, make threats, make everything unstable and horrible. Then you climb down one step and you get rewarded with some concessions here, some concessions there, concessions somewhere else. I would not exclude that this is kind of at least part of the Russian scenario, how they look at things at the moment.
That's interesting. I mean, that also strikes me as though that's straight out of the toolbook or the rule book of Trump as well. I mean, or maybe it's an authoritarian bent towards that it's threaten, and then whatever you then can secure after that is better than what you started with.
Yes, indeed. I mean, we can cite examples from Russian policy in that regard. That's one possibility. I'm not saying I'm speaking the absolute truth. Yeah. We're here to chat and to give you my best thinking. And I benefit. There is one thing why I think that I have something to say about this on occasions, because I've lived and worked in both Russia and Ukraine. I know the Russian narrative and the Ukrainian narrative from wonderful, good, reasonable people on both sides. Which on that, I know there is a toxic element to this quote, but they're really good people on both sides. In this conflict.
I couldn't. I mean, again, as an ethnic Bosnian, I grew up with the shadow of the war, hanging over me, and of course, a deep influence against the Serbs who were the aggressors and so on. But inevitably, that's politics and that's the narratives. On both sides, there are good people, fighting for what they believe is their truth. Yeah. So, what do you then make of? What do you make of President Putin's, what ended up being his first public comments that he made today, standing next to, his closest ally in NATO/EU, Orban? What do you make of his comments? Because he was trying to, and some analysts are saying he was trying to almost appease, although he did very clearly state that, the response from the US to his demands completely avoided any acknowledgement of Russian perspective or Russian fears. But he wants to continue talking. What do you make of those, given what you just said about the Russian kind of playbook?
Well, I would say they are not yet where they want to be, but they're kind of somewhere along the way. I think that would be the best interpretation of this. I mean, standing next to Orban, it's very clear that NATO is particularly the European Union is not united in their Russia policies. You have everything. I mean, again, I want to make it very simple and simplistic. There is two European, let's say, wings on Europe versus Russia. The one wing says there is no peace without Russia in Europe. Therefore, we must be talking. Dialogue is the solution. Let's find ways how we can get along, because there is no peace without Russia.
This is the traditional Ostpolitik kind of, right? The open the doors we have to bring.
Yeah. Ostpolitik, this is the view held by, even proclaimed by Germany, by Austria, by big countries. It's not a kind of obscene view. And then you have the view that says, with Russia, there can never be peace in Europe, and talking to Russia makes no sense, because all they do is lie, cheat, and steal. So we should stop talking to Russia, because having peace with them is a hopeless endeavor. And these are, Poland, Baltics, depending on the government, some others. And to reconcile these two positions, which I'm, of course, paraphrasing. So nobody says that, but I'm paraphrasing. To reconcile these two positions is very, very, very difficult. Therefore, there is no proper Russia policy of the European Union. And we've seen already, Croatian president said, in case there is a war, Croatian soldiers certainly not participating. Orban, for whom I have really no respect in other fields, going to Moscow, standing next to Putin. So Putin, that dividing the European Union is a strategic goal of Russian foreign policy is very clear. Yeah. They're succeeding. They're very, very well succeeding at that.
Yeah. Well, Hungary is an EU member and a NATO member, right? So I mean, you couldn't get a more powerful symbol, of effectively your tactical success. Really, I mean, because it is tactical. I mean, from a very small perspective, right? Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. So that's that. I think it was very clear also from Putin's statements that he did not want to communicate that he will attack Ukraine in 24 hours. That he did not want to communicate. And of course, in diplomacy, what you say publicly and what you say privately is always different. So whatever he said publicly, it was very well curated to arrive to make us ask exactly these questions, I would say.
And then, going back to the concentric circles, because I'm a visual learner, and that to me works really well. I can see the circles in my head. It strikes me as though there is, there needs to be some sort of a circle that's nudging from the outside into, and maybe through the outer one into the kind of second one, which is Europe and European issues. And we're seeing, a resurgence of the UK that's become very vocal, and it's almost demanding that, Europe respond. It's been sending weapons, from the first moment this erupted. We're seeing Macron, standing up. Of course, he's got election this year. So he's standing up. He wants to be the leader of Europe, and he wants to make a European solution. How do you see this playing out? I mean, it seems to me that all these big European countries, and they're all in one way, and I remember, I think, Johnson has a call with Putin today. Mario Draghi had a call with him yesterday. Macron was. What's that, sorry?
I'm sure that Mr. Putin will very much love the fact that he gets called by all these European leaders who have these little bilateral discussions with him, and not one line to a united Europe. This is the dream of Russian foreign policy.
Yeah, right. Okay.
They curate their messages nicely.
Yeah.
What he says to Johnson, what he says to Macron, what he says to Draghi, what he says to Scholz.
Yeah.
So then here we go. Yeah.
And that speaks to that point, right? That speaks to that point that there's no united European or EU foreign policy.
Indeed. I mean, on the British position, I think on the US one has to be careful to say it's really only to detract from domestic problems. When you think about Boris Johnson, it's in my opinion very obvious that he wants to distract from his, from the disastrous situation he's in the House of Commons and with his own party position. So here we go. Here we go of this. But when you talk about the concentric circles, I would like to remind you of another, let's say, image that we talked about, and these are the three baskets of the OSCE, of the Helsinki Final Act. And when Russia says they have security concerns, they mean they may only talk about the first basket, the weapons and the soldiers. But what they really probably have is security concerns in all three baskets, particularly in the economic and environmental. We talked about that. Right? So when you look at the Russian rhetoric recently, very interestingly, Russia continues talking about the OSCE. Lavrov spoke about the OSCE. We need the OSCE, the Istanbul, the indivisibility of security. I talked in the beginning about, the comprehensive concept of security. Lavrov has invoked that. The indivisibility of security. So a way forward, I mean, the question is, how do we get out of this conundrum now? It's very difficult to, once you've ramped up these tensions to climb down again. The Americans say, "Oh, sorry, we were wrong. There was no imminent invasion since November. The invasion is imminent," which is very strange. So, one way out would be to have a security security conference for Europe that has as its goal to find a security architecture which really makes everybody feel secure. And that means Russia needs to feel secure, but Ukraine needs to feel secure, and the West needs to feel secure. And there is only one organization where this, which seems predestined to do this, and this is the OSCE.
And I mean, that strikes me as a reasonable demand and request, is it not?
To have a conference like that is, I think it's a reasonable demand and a reasonable request. The question is if enough parties see enough interest, have enough interest in having such a conference. But having a conference and talks, as Churchill said, jaw is better than war. If that's the way out, where people can discuss, in a long process, why not in a long process, to really discuss European security, including economic connectivity, i.e. gas, including human rights, including weapons and soldiers, that would be a good solution for this. And the irony of this would also be another one. If something like that happens, if you look up the history of the Helsinki Final Act in 1975, the birth of comprehensive security, it was in essence an opportunity, a forum in which to talk about human rights with the Soviet Union. That's why you have all these Helsinki commissions, Helsinki Charter, Helsinki this, Helsinki that. Because for the first time, the Soviet Union agreed to talk with the West about human rights in exchange that the West would talk with them about, weapons and soldiers and tanks and atomic weapons. I think we can see something here. That would be also quite interesting. If we say, listen, if you want to talk concretely about security, let's talk about your human rights situation. Let's talk about Navalny. Let's talk about the elections. Let's talk about this. I'm a little bit idealistic here and maybe not very realistic. But if you want to look for a constructive way out, if you want to have some kind of a, policy, that would be the way to move forward. And when I'm saying this could be a long-term process, let us also recall that Mr. Putin is not a young man anymore, and and this process could outlast Mr. Putin. The Helsinki process lasted a couple of years. So that is something I could say, how that would be one way to get out of this really difficult situation at the moment.
The only, I guess, piece to that is that the US doesn't necessarily sit at the helm, if it's certainly if it's headed by the OSCE.
Well, the US is a member of the OSCE, so is Russia. And I think to have a conference and a forum in which the parties and the partners could meet each other at the same eye level, is not necessarily bad. But what is also important in this context is that Europe, the European Union, Western Europe, will really have a position. And I do think that European interests on pan-European security are not necessarily 100% overlapping with US interests in pan-European. That means there should be a European-led design they are largely overlapping, but not 100% overlapping. So there should be a European-led design of European security policy that is not necessarily 100% dictated by the United States. And I will go one step further. The role that Ukraine plays in such a European security architecture, that needs to make everybody feel secure, including Ukraine, including Russia.
My question, I guess, would be, does Putin have a leg to stand on when he makes the demands that he makes and the claims that he makes? That, the West is, I guess, and what he's also saying, what he said earlier today, is that while it's okay for a country, and speaking about Ukraine, to choose its own security arrangements, what the West is professing, why the West can't say Ukraine will never join NATO. Putin is also saying, yeah, that's fine, but a country can't guarantee or improve its own security at the cost of another country.
That's right.
That again, I mean, looking at it pragmatically, that seems like a reasonable statement to make, notwithstanding that this is Putin we're talking about, who, has proven to be a rogue actor at times. Like you said before, he's certainly pushing for the Russian interests, and he's a rational actor. But without a doubt, he's invaded Crimea, he's invaded eastern Ukraine, etc. So we're not talking about a peace-loving man. We are talking about a pragmatist who will exploit opportunities. So how credible are his claims? And then how credible is it that if he does secure some smaller victories from the US, that he actually backs down, as opposed to continue slowly disintegrating the European Union, which is, he's doing that rather well.
Indeed. And when you started your question by asking, does Putin have a leg to stand on? And that depends on what he wants. And we all don't know what he wants. I've speculated about this. I've mentioned a couple of topics, dividing Europe, getting Nord Stream 2, asserting yourself as a great power. I'm sure there is a mixture of this that he wants. So, but we don't know exactly what he wants and what is, enough. What is just, that's just good enough to, back down. And because we don't know that, we don't know whether he actually has a leg to stand on. What he, if you don't know what's good enough for him, what he really wants to achieve, it's hard to say. But what I can say a little bit also in conclusion is, again, has to do with with European security architecture. And I think it's very important. And this is one of the OSCE principles, that no country can increase its security at the cost of another country. And this is just a different way to say we need a European security architecture where every participant really feels secure. And that goes for Russia, and that goes for Ukraine. What we cannot do is say, as the West, listen, Russia, you should feel secure enough. We have determined that you're actually secure. But we can also not do that with Ukraine. Many people would be saying, this is very popular where I come from, why doesn't Ukraine just, why don't they just choose neutrality like Austria? It would be so great, all the problems would be solved. It's because the majority of Ukrainians would not feel secure if they chose neutrality. Their neutrality has been violated. Their trust has been broken. So to find a new arrangement where everybody really in their own conviction, not in the conviction of others, actually feels secure, I think that's the challenge that we have to overcome now. And that's also how we will get out of this conundrum that we have at the moment between Russia and the West.
That is, that is hugely insightful, actually. That has answered a lot of my questions, because one of the things that Putin's being attacked on is, he's trying to increase his sphere of influence. But I think you made the point right at the start. He's also talking about the NATO sphere of influence, but in reality, it's not even NATO, it's US. And again, we all know, NATO is led by US, and, NATO is the US in many ways. So of course, even though Ukraine was nowhere near or is nowhere near joining NATO, in any near future, even any kind of whispers or talks of that or leaning towards Europe is certainly going to add fuel to that fire. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wolfgang, it's been absolutely fantastic. A very insightful conversation. Thank you very much for giving me so much of your time.
Thank you, Maz.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of The Voices of War. You can access all episodes on www.thevoicesofwar.com or by subscribing wherever you get your favourite podcasts. And while you're there, please give us a review, as we'd love to hear what you think. If you'd like to recommend a guest for the show, you can reach me on info@thevoicesofwar.com.